There's a moment you don't talk about, the one where she looked at you just a second longer than usual, and something shifted. You felt it, but you brushed it off, because it wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious. It was subtle, like the quiet hum before a storm you're not sure is coming. Maybe it was the way she asked about your weekend with too much softness, or the way her laugh lingered when no one else was laughing. You didn't dare believe it meant something, but something inside you paused. The truth is, most men miss it, not because they're blind, but because they're trained not to see, trained to wait for clear signs, bold moves, perfect moments. But women don't move like that, not when they're truly interested. The first signs of desire aren't in words, they're in the space between them. They live in hesitation, in stolen glances, in the way her energy shifts, not away from you, but toward you softly, quietly, like a tide pulling you without ever making a sound. And this is where the confusion begins, because you don't know if it's real. You don't know if she meant to lean closer, or if you imagined it. You start questioning the tone of her voice, the timing of her smile. You wonder, was that just kindness, or was it interest hiding in plain sight? This is the invisible shift, the space where attraction is born, not through certainty, but through doubt. And if you don't know how to feel it, you'll miss it completely, like standing in sunlight and never noticing the warmth. But a Stoic sees differently. He doesn't chase signs. He reads patterns. He doesn't beg for affirmation. He tunes into energy. Ancient philosophy never taught men to guess. It taught them to observe, to see clearly where others are distracted by desire. And if you can learn to quiet the noise inside you, the craving, the fear, the ego, you might start to notice the subtle language of female interest. Not through what she says, but through what she allows herself to show, only when she feels safe enough to be seen. You noticed it, didn't you? That subtle dissonance. The way her words sounded right, but something in the timing felt off, like music playing slightly out of tune. She asked about your day, but her eyes weren't really there. She laughed, but the warmth didn't reach her voice. And you, trying not to seem paranoid, told yourself it was nothing. But deep down, something tugged at your gut, not fear, not sadness, just a quiet ache, the kind that comes when energy shifts and no one admits it. It's strange how connection fades, not in a scream, but in a whisper. You still show up. She still replies. The gestures are all there, but they've lost their gravity. They float, unanchored, like echoes in a hollow room. What used to feel magnetic now feels mechanical. And the worst part, you start editing yourself, toning things down, second-guessing jokes, walking on emotional eggshells. Not because she asked you to, but because something in her presence made you feel you had to. That's when the mind begins its spiral. You analyze tone, timing, the space between messages. You start compensating, giving more, asking less. You start chasing presence when once you simply were. It's not that she's being cruel. No one said anything wrong. That's what makes it harder. There's no story to hold on to, just a vague sense that you're slipping into someone else's rhythm, no longer sure if it's music or noise. You call it confusion, but it's your intuition whispering, this isn't resonance, this is imbalance. A Stoic learns to trust that whisper. He doesn't react with panic, but with perception. He doesn't beg for connection. He observes disconnection without drowning in it. Because sometimes what feels off is off. And it's not your job to fix what isn't being offered. She may not be pulling away to hurt you. She may be uncertain, unready, or already elsewhere. But your clarity begins the moment you stop tuning yourself to frequencies that don't hear you. That's not bitterness. That's self-respect, finally waking up. It always starts the same way, small. You begin adjusting, not consciously, just little shifts. You wait a bit longer before replying, just to seem less eager. You tell shorter stories, avoid deeper truths, in case they make you too much. You start shrinking, not out of fear, but out of calculation. You call it awareness. You think it's strategy, but it's not. It's the slow dismantling of presence. And she doesn't even have to ask for it. You volunteer it, piece by piece. That's the disguised pattern. the erosion disguised as effort, the overthinking disguised as sensitivity. You're not showing up more honestly, you're editing for approval. And it's subtle. It wears the face of care, of emotional intelligence. But underneath, it's anxiety wearing a polite suit. The Stoics warned against this. Living to fit into someone else's frame is to abandon your own. But most men don't notice it until the frame has collapsed, until they look in the mirror and see someone unfamiliar. Imagine a tree that bends a little every day toward the wind. At first, it's just survival, but over time it loses its shape. That's what happens when you keep bending your energy to stay liked, stay relevant, stay safe. You forget what your own stillness feels like. And worse, she feels it too. Not always consciously, but she senses when you stop anchoring, when your gravity turns to performance. She might not name it, but she withdraws from it. Because the moment you stop leading your own presence, you stop being magnetic. Ask yourself gently, when did I start managing myself instead of being myself? That's the pivot point. The moment when attraction fades, not because she changed, but because you did. Because you began playing not to lose her, instead of living in the truth that drew her in. And if this sounds familiar, don't shame yourself. Just notice it. That's where power returns. Not in being perfect, but in catching the pattern before it rewrites you again. This isn't punishment, it's a wake up. The question is, are you ready to stop rehearsing and start remembering? Silence for most is unbearable. It feels like a void that demands to be filled. Words, gestures, explanations. But a woman's silence, that's a language. Sometimes it's a test, sometimes it's a shield. But often, it's simply space to feel, to observe, to breathe. The untrained man rushes to fix it. He over-explains, over-offers, overextends. But a Stoic man pauses. He lets the silence speak. Because he knows silence is not absence, it's weight. And only those who can hold it, without shaking, are truly seen. From a psychological lens, silence builds tension, and tension builds memory. The brain remembers what it can't resolve. This is why mystery seduces more than clarity. A well-timed pause leaves more of a mark than a flood of words. When you don't fill every gap, her imagination starts working. That's not manipulation, it's nature. The key is intent. If your silence is reactive, it repels. If it's anchored, it draws her in, not with force, but with gravity. Not to chase you, but to find herself pulled without knowing why. But here's where most men fail. They confuse retreat with restraint. They go silent not out of composure, but out of fear. That kind of silence is hollow, a defense mechanism. It smells of insecurity, not strength, and women feel that. They may not articulate it, but they sense the difference between a man who's holding ground and one who's avoiding fire. The Stoic's silence isn't cold, it's considered. It holds space without collapsing. It says, I don't need to control this moment. I only need to remain present in it. Attraction doesn't live in noise. It lives in contrast, in tension, in restraint. When a man can be still, not because he's empty, but because he's full, he becomes unpredictable in the most grounded way. She doesn't know what he'll say next, because he's not performing, he's observing, responding, choosing. That's the essence of masculine presence. And in a world that begs men to prove, to please, to pursue, the one who simply knows and waits without flinching, that man is unforgettable. Not because he spoke loudly, but because he didn't have to. What if you didn't fall in love with her, but with how she made you feel? With who you believed you were in her presence? The way she looked at you, not necessarily with depth, but with focus, reflected something. A version of yourself that felt important, chosen, desired. But here's the fracture you didn't see. She wasn't a mirror made to define you. She was a moment. And you mistook a flicker of chemistry for a glimpse of forever. That's not love. That's projection wearing perfume. Real intimacy begins where illusion ends. But most men don't want intimacy. Not at first. They want to feel significant, seen. And when a woman gives them just enough, just the right glance, the delayed laugh, the silence that lingers, they do the rest. They fill in the gaps with fantasy. They write her depth before she ever reveals it. They imagine connection in pauses, But a Stoic sees the danger in this. Marcus Aurelius said, "If someone does wrong, it's because they are mistaken about what's good." The same applies to self-deception. You weren't wrong for feeling drawn to her. You were human, but the deeper truth, you fell in love with your reflection in her interest. You loved the version of you that you thought she confirmed. And when that energy changed, when the mirror cracked, you mistook it for her fading. But maybe she was never fully there. Maybe she never promised what your hope whispered. You didn't lose her. You lost the illusion you built around a woman who never asked to hold that role. And now you're here, not heartbroken, but awakened. Stoicism doesn't ask you to stop loving. It asks you to see clearly, to know the difference between being valued and being temporarily admired, between love and emotional hunger. The next time you feel that pull, that glance, that silence, pause. Ask yourself, am I drawn to her? Or to the version of myself I see in her eyes? Because when the reflection fades, only the truth remains, and love, real love, begins where projection ends. There was a moment, quiet, forgettable on the surface, where something in you bent. Maybe it was when you stopped saying what you truly thought and started saying what you hoped she'd approve of. Maybe it was when you noticed her pulling back, and instead of stepping into your stillness, you leaned in. Just slightly, just enough to shift the dynamic. That was the moment you gave yourself away, not all at once. But the slow unraveling began, not of love, but of self. What began as magnetism turned into maintenance. You no longer walked in your own frame, you adjusted to hers. You stopped leading with clarity and started tiptoeing with caution, hoping not to lose her, hoping your softness would keep her interested. And in doing so, you flipped the polarity, from presence to performance, from depth to approval seeking. You called it love. But the truth, you were no longer loving her. You were campaigning for her permission to stay relevant. There's a bitter irony in this. The more you contort yourself to be needed, the less she feels your gravity, because women don't stay for perfection, they stay for truth, for groundedness, for a man who can be unmoved even when desire whispers, do more, be more, say less, a man who doesn't barter authenticity for affection. Stoicism reminds us, don't value yourself based on what is out of your control. Her attention, her validation, her response, that's her realm. Yours is how firmly you hold your center when they waver. So ask yourself now, not with shame, but with clarity, was I loving her or proving myself to her? Because the answer changes everything. It frees you, not from her, but from the quiet desperation that made you compromise your own rhythm. That's the real awakening. You don't need to be chosen to be valuable. You don't need to be kept to be whole. Is the moment you realize that, is the moment you come back to yourself. And the man who returns, he no longer begs to be seen. He simply is. What if she wasn't the problem? What if she wasn't leading you on, confusing you, pulling away? What if she was just reflecting silently, clearly, the parts of you that were already unsure? That discomfort you felt, it wasn't hers. It was yours, magnified in her presence. Her silence didn't create your doubt. It revealed it. And that moment when you bent, when you reached, when you compromised your frame to be kept, she didn't demand it. You offered it, hoping she'd fix what was never her job to heal. Marcus Aurelius said, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. But how often did you give that power away? When she paused, you panicked. When she changed, you clung. You weren't responding to her. You were reacting to your own fear of not being enough. That's what Stoicism demands we face, not the woman, not the situation, but the internal storm that convinces us love must be earned through sacrifice. And until you face that storm, it will keep choosing for you. The Stoic mirror doesn't show you how she feels. It shows you why you feel what you feel. It shows you the gap between your worth and your belief about it. It shows you that you weren't heartbroken because she left. You were heartbroken because you left yourself first. Epictetus taught that freedom begins the moment we stop blaming others for how we feel. So the next time you hear silence, don't ask what it means about her. Ask what it awakens in you. Because that's the only place change begins. This is not a story about her. It never was. It's a story about your need to be chosen, to be seen, to matter. And the longer you chase that validation outside yourself, the more you'll repeat this loop: new faces, same age. But now you have a choice. You can keep seeking mirrors, or become the one who doesn't need reflection to remember his shape. That's what Stoicism offers. Not immunity from feeling, but sovereignty within it. You don't need to control her. You need to reclaim yourself. Late at night, when the room is quiet and the phone is finally still, there's a question that surfaces, soft, unwelcome, but persistent. Was I ever really enough for her? Or was she just being kind? You never say it aloud. You mask it with logic, with pride, with silence. But it lingers. Not in words, but in how you hesitate before texting, how you over-explain, how you shrink just slightly when she pulls away. It's not the uncertainty that hurts most. It's your refusal to face the question directly. We think unspoken questions die in silence. But they don't. They morph. They drive behaviors you don't even realize you're performing. Did she ever feel the same? Becomes you waiting longer for replies. Was I too much? Becomes you holding back your truth. These questions are ghosts, unseen but always present. And like all ghosts, they feed on avoidance. The Stoics would ask, why suffer twice? Once in the moment, and again in the echo of what you never dared to confront. When you don't name your doubt, it owns you. You don't become stoic by suppressing fear. You become stoic by facing it, calmly, directly, with eyes wide open. The longer you avoid asking yourself the real questions, the more your actions will unconsciously answer them for you. Every unspoken insecurity becomes a strategy. Every suppressed ache becomes performance. You think you're being composed, but you're actually being controlled. Not by her, not by reality, but by the things you never dared to feel fully. So here's the truth no one tells you: it's not her silence that damaged you. It's yours. The silence between you and yourself. The silence that swallowed your truth in exchange for being liked, being kept, being enough. But the man who dares to ask, where did I abandon myself in this? He's not broken. He's becoming someone who no longer runs from the fog of doubt, but walks through it with steady breath. Because clarity doesn't come from answers. It comes from finally asking the right questions out loud. She doesn't test you because she wants to play. She tests you because she wants to feel. Not logic, not facts, but energy, depth, safety. A woman's mind is a terrain of instinct wrapped in emotion. When she withdraws after intimacy, goes silent after connection, changes rhythm without warning, it's not always confusion. Sometimes it's calibration. She's feeling the frame, testing not your words, but your structure, not to trap you, but to see if you can hold steady when everything in her wants to flee and be found at the same time. To the unaware man, this feels manipulative, like a game meant to control, but in truth it's ancient. A woman's push-pull isn't a tactic, it's a question in motion. Can you handle who I am when I'm not easy to read? Can I be messy and still be met with clarity? What she's searching for isn't dominance or attention. It's containment, walls, but presence. And the moment you flinch, chase, or collapse under her change in mood, she doesn't punish you, she just knows you were only steady when she was. The Stoics taught us, be tolerant with others, strict with yourself. This is that principle in real time. Her fluctuations aren't the threat, they're the invitation. To stay unmoved, not with coldness, but with warmth that doesn't beg. A woman who senses that you can't stay rooted without constant validation won't trust your strength when it matters most. Because what she truly needs isn't perfection, it's predictability. Not in what you'll say, but in who you remain when her storms roll in. So, no, she's not playing games to manipulate you. She's watching, waiting, asking without words, will you abandon yourself to win me? Or will you remain whole enough that I can trust you won't disappear once I'm close? That's what all the mixed signals were. Not confusion, but coded language. The man who sees this, not as chaos, but as feminine logic, doesn't resist it. He doesn't perform, doesn't chase, doesn't fold. He holds. And that holding, that's what makes her let the games fall away. because she's finally safe to stop playing. There comes a moment when you realize you've been dancing to music you didn't choose, responding, adjusting, reacting, not because you decided to, but because her shifts pulled you out of yourself. That's when the frame is lost. Not when she changes, but when you forget you're the one holding the rhythm. Reclaiming the frame doesn't mean becoming louder. It means becoming still. Stoicism isn't cold detachment. It's disciplined clarity. It's choosing your posture regardless of the temperature in the room. A reactive man folds into her mood. A grounded man makes space for it without losing himself. This is the difference between being emotionally intelligent and being emotionally led. One listens, the other surrenders. Reclaiming the frame means returning to your internal compass, not to control her, but to stop being controlled by her storms. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Her silence, her pullback, her chaos, they're not yours to fix. Your responsibility is how you respond. So you slow down. You stop chasing answers with frantic gestures. You breathe through the ambiguity. You speak when there's truth, not when there's tension. That's frame. A quiet refusal to leave your throne every time her winds shift direction. You don't need to punish, ignore, or manipulate. You simply hold. Let her come closer, let her pull away. But never let her motion become your identity. Respect doesn't bloom from need. It blooms from unwavering presence. You can't control her reactions. You can only control your presence. Because the goal was never to be loved the way you craved. The goal was to be respected for who you are, without distortion. That is what real masculine energy offers, a place where emotion can be felt but not feared, where connection can happen but not consume. And when she sees that you're no longer molding yourself to earn her comfort, something shifts. Not in her, in you. Because finally, you're no longer asking, how should I be for her? You're declaring, this is who I am, and I will not move. Now it's quiet, not her silence, but yours. Not the kind that waits or fears, but the kind that knows. You sit with everything that once made you doubt, and it doesn't shake you anymore. The glance that lingered too long. The laugh that echoed past its meaning. You remember them? But now, you don't chase their answer. You simply see. With the clarity of a man who no longer needs certainty to feel anchored. The fog hasn't lifted because she spoke. It lifted because you stopped needing her to. You walk through the same moments differently now. The same text she delayed to answer. The same shift in tone. But they no longer call your worth into question, because the man who stands like the oak does not flinch when the wind rises. He does not call the storm unfair. He does not ask it to soften. He simply endures, rooted, not out of pride, but out of alignment. Because when you see clearly, you don't need control, you need congruence, and that is enough. There is no villain in your story now. No her to blame, no you to hate, just lessons, patterns, echoes fading in the distance. What once felt like rejection now feels like redirection. What once stung as loss now settles as refinement. You're no longer trying to get back to who you were before her. You've grown past that man. And you don't need her presence to validate the shift. Because when you look in the mirror now, you finally see a man not asking to be chosen, but choosing himself. And perhaps that's the final truth. You never needed more signs. You never needed her to speak what you already felt. From the very beginning, phase one, it was there. A flicker, a signal. Not from her, but from within. You called it tension. You called it attraction. But maybe it was your deeper self whispering, there's something here you must learn. And you did, not by winning her, but by finding the still point in yourself that doesn't move, even when everything else does. It started with a glance, barely a moment. Something shifted in the air, and you felt it, not loud, not clear, just enough to stir your mind. Back then, you mistook it for magic. You leaned in, interpreted silence as mystery. You adjusted, reacted, hoping to hold on to something that never quite revealed itself. But now you see, you weren't chasing her. You were chasing a reflection, a version of yourself you believed was only real when she looked back at you. You thought attraction was about signs, signals, strategy, But what unraveled you wasn't her, it was how quickly you abandoned your center to feel worthy. And still, there was no punishment in that path. Only education. You learned what happens when you confuse being chosen with being seen. You learned how easily a man can trade depth for proximity, truth for attention, and how the more you give to be kept, the less of you remains. Until silence isn't what hurts, it's what exposes. You stepped into that mirror and watched yourself shift, shrink, shape, until the reflection no longer felt like you. But then something cracked, not because she left, but because you finally stayed. Stayed in the question, stayed in the tension, stayed with yourself. And that's when everything changed. Because this wasn't about her clarity, it was about yours. She didn't need to speak. You just needed to stop pretending you hadn't heard yourself all along. So no, you don't need to become someone else to be loved. You never did. What you needed was to become someone you could sit with when the silence grew heavy. That is the true frame. That is the man she may feel, even before he speaks, not because he performs, but because he knows. And now, as you trace the same steps with new eyes, you don't ask, what went wrong? You whisper, I remember who I am. And that is where the real story begins. You've walked through the story, not hers, yours. You've seen where you bent, where you reached, where you forgot that love without self-respect isn't love. And now comes the quiet part, the part that matters most. What will you do with this clarity? Because knowing is not the same as changing. And if you close this video and do nothing, the loop will return. Different name, different smile, same pattern, same ache. Clarity without action is just a more painful form of blindness. So here's your choice, soft but irreversible. You can carry this insight like a souvenir, or you can let it burn a little deeper. Let it change the way you speak, the way you listen, the way you choose. Let it turn silence into space, not fear. Let it turn boundaries into clarity, not walls. And if this landed somewhere real inside you, maybe you don't need another answer. Maybe you need a new way of living the questions. A new way of standing, especially when your knees remember how to kneel. The Stoics never promised comfort. They offered peace. And peace isn't found in being loved, it's found in being whole. That's your task now. Sit with what you've seen, revisit the echoes, and if you're ready to go deeper, don't do it alone. Read the pages of men who've sat in that same fire. Join a room where silence is not weakness, but respect, where presence isn't noise, but power. If you want to lead in love, you must first stop following ghosts inside your own chest. Or you can scroll on, pretend this was just another video, another voice that brushed past something too raw to hold. No one will blame you, but the version of you who's listening now. He'll remember that this moment wasn't small, that it asked for something. Not reaction, but response. So here's the final call. Don't just learn, decide, and when you do, don't rush. Just stand still. That's where men are made, not in motion, but in the stillness they're no longer afraid to stay in. Tonight, before the world distracts you again, find a quiet place. No phone, no music, just you and your breath. Set a timer, 5 minutes. Sit in complete stillness. No fixing, no remembering, just being. If your mind wanders to her, let it. If your chest tightens, stay there. Don't flinch. That discomfort you feel, it's not weakness. It's the edge of something unclaimed. The version of you that doesn't need to perform, doesn't chase, doesn't explain. Only waits for you to stop avoiding him. Now ask yourself, without looking away, what part of me have I been trading to feel loved? Don't write it down. Don't answer too quickly. Just let the question breathe. Because the Stoic path isn't about answers, it's about having the courage to sit with questions most men never ask. If you can hold that question without rushing to soothe it, without trying to solve it, you're already different. Not because you've become someone new, but because you've stopped abandoning who you already were. That's the challenge. Not to say more, prove more, achieve more, but to remain unmoved long enough that your truth returns on its own. In a world that rewards urgency, stillness is rebellion. In a world that sells you validation, self-containment is rare currency. The next time she pauses, the next time you feel that magnetic pull to chase, don't. Wait. Breathe. Watch what remains when you no longer reach. That's not distance. That's your gravity reawakening. You don't need to leave a comment. You don't need to share this. But if this touched something buried, then carry this with you like a quiet vow from now on. I don't leave myself to be loved. That's your Stoic challenge, not grand, not loud, just consistent. Every room you walk into, every silence you feel, ask, am I here fully or adjusting to be accepted? And when the pull returns, as it always does, pause. That pause is the moment a man is either lost again or finally found. You remember it, don't you? That first moment, the glance that lingered too long, the warmth that flickered, then faded. Back then it felt like a sign, an opening. You leaned in, quietly hoping to be chosen. But now, you see it differently. It wasn't a doorway, it was a mirror. And what you saw wasn't her. It was the part of you waiting for permission to exist fully. That moment hasn't changed, you have. The man who started this journey was reading between silences, questioning his own value through someone else's reactions. But the man standing here now doesn't chase the warmth. He becomes it. He doesn't search for signs. He watches, still, grounded, letting the world move around him without losing his center. What changed? Not the woman, not the story, just your willingness to stop negotiating with shadows. And yet, something deeper waits. Because beneath attraction, beneath the need to be seen, there is still a boy. One who was taught to earn love, to shrink for peace, to please for presence. You've seen the man, but have you met the boy? Have you looked into his fear without flinching? In our next conversation, we'll go there, not to fix him, but to free him. Because the frame you hold now, it's only as strong as the child within you believes it can be. Until then, stay silent but alert, stay present but unbent. Let the next woman's glance be just that, a glance. Not a story, not a test, not a mirror. You've already seen enough. And when the tension rises again, because it will, don't rush to name it. Just remember the stillness you earned. The one that began the moment you stopped asking, does she want me? And started answering, do I still want to leave myself for this?